Picture this. You're sitting in your favorite coffee shop, scrolling through your phone, when suddenly you stop. Something feels empty inside, like there's a voice trying to reach you, but you can't quite hear it through all the noise of daily life. You close your eyes for just a moment and wonder, is God really trying to tell me something? Is there a message waiting for me that could change everything? What if I told you that over 500 years ago, a young Spanish soldier received a divine message so powerful that it not only transformed his own life, but created a spiritual revolution that continues to this very moment, reaching across centuries to touch your heart right where you are sitting today? That soldier was Ignatius of Loyola, and the message God gave him wasn't just for him. It was meant for you, for this exact moment in your spiritual journey, for the very struggles you're facing right now in your relationship with the divine. The message began in the most unlikely place imaginable. Ignatius wasn't praying in a cathedral or reading scripture when God first spoke to his heart. He was lying in a hospital bed in 1521, his leg shattered by a cannonball during the siege of Pamplona. Picture a man whose entire identity revolved around military glory, courtly romance, and worldly success, suddenly forced into complete stillness and silence. For weeks, all he could do was lie there, unable to move, unable to pursue the dreams that had consumed his every waking moment. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about God's timing. It was precisely in this moment of complete helplessness that the divine message began to unfold. As Ignatius lay there, bored and frustrated, he asked for books to read. The only books available were a life of Christ and stories of the saints. Reluctantly, almost begrudgingly, he began to read them, expecting nothing more than entertainment to pass the long hours of recovery. But something extraordinary began to happen as he read. Ignatius started to notice something subtle yet profound about his inner life. When he daydreamed about returning to court, winning the favor of a certain lady, achieving military honors, and gaining worldly recognition, he felt excited in the moment. But after these fantasies passed, he noticed he felt dry, empty, and somehow unsatisfied deep in his soul. However, when he read about Christ and the saints, when he imagined himself following in their footsteps, serving God with the same passion he had once reserved for worldly pursuits, something different happened. Not only did he feel consolation and peace during these thoughts, but the sense of joy and purpose lingered long afterward, leaving him with a deep satisfaction that seemed to come from the very core of his being. This was the first part of God's message to Ignatius, and it's the same message being whispered to your heart right now. Pay attention to what brings you lasting peace versus what brings you momentary pleasure. God was teaching Ignatius, and through him teaching us, how to recognize the voice of the divine speaking through the movements of our own hearts. This wasn't just psychological insight, this was divine pedagogy, God himself becoming Ignatius's teacher in the art of spiritual discernment. The message was clear. I will speak to you through your deepest desires, through the consolations and desolations of your inner life, through the very longings of your heart when you learn to listen with spiritual ears. Think about your own life for a moment. When you're honest with yourself, really honest, what are the thoughts and dreams that leave you feeling empty afterward? What are the pursuits that promise happiness, but deliver only a hollow satisfaction that fades as quickly as it came? And conversely, what are those moments, perhaps fleeting, when you feel a deep sense of rightness, of being aligned with something greater than yourself? These aren't random emotions or psychological quirks. According to the message God gave to Ignatius, these are the very means by which the divine communicates with each human soul, the sacred language through which heaven speaks to earth within the sanctuary of your own heart. But God's message to Ignatius went much deeper than personal discernment. As his recovery progressed and his spiritual awakening intensified, Ignatius began to understand that this inner dialogue with the divine wasn't meant to be a private mystical experience. God wasn't calling him to become a hermit or to pursue a life of isolated contemplation. Instead, the message that emerged was revolutionary. Find God in all things, and help others find God in all things too. This became the cornerstone of what we now call Ignatian spirituality. But it began as a direct divine communication to a broken soldier, lying in a hospital bed, wondering if his life had any meaning beyond the temporary pleasures and honors he had been chasing. The beauty of this message is that it completely reframes how we understand the spiritual life. God wasn't telling Ignatius to escape the world, but to discover the divine presence already hidden within every aspect of human experience. Whether in prayer or conversation, in work or rest, in joy or suffering, in success or failure, God could be found if one learned how to look with the eyes of faith. This wasn't pantheism or some vague spirituality that sees God as everything and everything as God. Rather, it was the profound recognition that the God who created all things remains intimately present within creation, working through human events, relationships, and even struggles to draw each soul closer to divine love. I want to pause here for a moment and ask you something that might touch the deepest part of your spiritual journey. Have you ever felt like your faith and your daily life exist in two separate worlds? As if God is present on Sunday morning or during your prayer time, but somehow absent from your work, your relationships, your struggles, your dreams. If you're nodding right now, I want you to know that you're not alone in feeling this disconnect. Many of us have inherited a vision of spirituality that creates an artificial separation between the sacred and the secular, between prayer and ordinary life. If this resonates with you, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I want to find God in my everyday life." And if you feel comfortable, tell us about one area of your life where you struggle to sense God's presence. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today, to feel understood in their own spiritual search. Sometimes, the simple act of acknowledging our spiritual hunger is the first step toward discovering that God has been present all along, waiting for us to recognize the divine fingerprints on every moment of our existence. As Ignatius continued to grow in understanding, God's message became even more specific and personal. Through a series of mystical experiences, particularly during his time of prayer by the River Cardinal, Ignatius received what he described as an illumination that taught him more about divine truth than all his previous studies combined. But here's what's so remarkable. This wasn't abstract theological knowledge. God was showing Ignatius practical wisdom about how to help other souls recognize and respond to divine movement in their own lives. The message was becoming not just personal transformation, but apostolic mission. God was preparing Ignatius to become a guide for other seekers, a spiritual father who could help people navigate the same journey of discovery that he himself was experiencing. This is where the message takes on universal significance that speaks directly to your own spiritual journey. God didn't give Ignatius these insights so he could become a spiritual celebrity or religious authority figure. The divine message was always oriented toward service, toward helping others discover their own unique relationship with the divine. Every insight Ignatius received, every method of prayer he developed, every principle of discernment he articulated, all of it was given as a gift to be shared with anyone who hungered for a deeper relationship with God. The spiritual exercises that Ignatius eventually developed weren't his invention in the way we normally think of human creativity. They emerged directly from the divine message he had received, a kind of spiritual technology that God had revealed to him through his own experience and then refined through years of helping others encounter the living God in their prayer. When you read the exercises today, you're not just reading the spiritual insights of a 16th century Spanish mystic. You're receiving the same divine message that God first communicated to Ignatius in that hospital room, adapted and developed through decades of spiritual direction with people from every walk of life. Consider the profound implications of this. The God who spoke to Ignatius is the same God who desires to communicate with you right now. The divine voice that guided him through his discernment of spirits, that taught him to find the sacred in the ordinary, that called him to serve others in their spiritual journeys, that same voice is speaking to your heart as you listen to these words. God's message to Ignatius wasn't limited by time or culture or historical circumstances. It was a message about the fundamental nature of divine love and how that love seeks to communicate itself to every human heart willing to listen. But let's be completely honest about something that Ignatius discovered, and that you might be experiencing right now. This divine communication doesn't always come in dramatic mystical experiences or overwhelming spiritual consolations. Much more often, God's message comes through what Ignatius learned to call ordinary providence, the subtle movements of grace working through everyday circumstances, relationships, challenges, and opportunities. God was teaching Ignatius to recognize the divine presence, not only in moments of prayer, but in conversations with friends, in decisions about his future, in encounters with people in need, in the very texture of daily life. This might be exactly what you need to hear today. Maybe you've been waiting for some dramatic sign from heaven, some unmistakable voice from above that will solve all your spiritual questions and point you clearly toward God's will for your life. But what if the divine message you're seeking is already being communicated through the very circumstances you're living through right now? What if God is speaking to you through that relationship challenge you've been facing, through that career decision that's been weighing on your mind, through that persistent sense that there must be something more meaningful than the routine you've fallen into? Ignatius learned that God's message often comes disguised as ordinary human experience, requiring what he called contemplation in action, the ability to remain spiritually attentive while fully engaged in the practical demands of life. This wasn't about becoming so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. It was about developing such sensitivity to divine movement that you could recognize God's presence and respond to God's call, whether you were in a chapel or a marketplace, whether you were praying or working, whether you were experiencing spiritual consolation, or going through a period of dryness and difficulty. The message God gave to Ignatius about finding divine presence in all things revolutionized not only his own spiritual life, but his understanding of how to serve others. He began to see that true apostolic work isn't about imposing religious obligations on people or trying to convince them to accept certain doctrines. Rather, authentic spiritual service means helping people discover the divine love that's already present in their lives, waiting to be recognized and embraced. This is why the Jesuits, the religious order that Ignatius founded, became known for their work in education, their ministry to people on the margins of society, their engagement with culture and science and social justice. God's message to Ignatius was essentially this: I am already at work in the world, already present in human hearts, already drawing all creation toward divine love. Your role is not to bring me to places where I'm absent, but to help people recognize where I'm already present and active in their lives. This perspective transformed everything about how Ignatius understood evangelization, spiritual direction, education, and social engagement. It wasn't about building religious empires or converting people through argument and pressure. It was about what he called helping souls, assisting people in recognizing and responding to the divine movement already happening within their own experience. This has profound implications for how you understand your own spiritual life and your relationships with others. You're not trying to force God into your circumstances or manipulate divine favor through perfect prayer and behavior. God is already present, already working, already communicating through the very situations and relationships and challenges that make up your daily existence. Your spiritual journey is about learning to recognize this presence, to cooperate with this divine activity, to align yourself with the love that's already surrounding you and calling you into deeper union with the source of all life. But here's where God's message to Ignatius becomes even more personal and challenging. Through years of prayer and discernment, Ignatius came to understand that divine love isn't content to remain a private comfort or personal consolation. The God who communicates with us through our deepest desires and longings is the same God who calls us to participate in divine mission, to become instruments of the same love we've received. The message wasn't just find God in all things, but help others find God in all things too. This is why Ignatius developed what he called the contemplation to attain love, a prayer exercise designed to help people recognize how they've been loved by God in every aspect of their existence, and then to respond with gratitude that naturally flows into generous service. God was showing Ignatius that authentic spiritual experience always moves from receiving divine love to sharing that love with others. The message was never meant to create spiritual individualists who hoard divine consolations for their own satisfaction. It was meant to form what Ignatius called contemplatives in action, people who could remain united with God while actively engaged in serving human need. Think about the people in your life right now who seem spiritually hungry, who are searching for meaning and purpose, who are struggling with difficult decisions or painful circumstances. According to the message God gave to Ignatius, you have a role to play in their spiritual journey, not as a preacher or religious authority, but as someone who has learned to recognize divine movement and can help others develop the same sensitivity. This might happen through a listening ear, a word of encouragement, a practical act of service, or simply the witness of someone who lives with obvious peace and purpose. God's message to Ignatius about apostolic service was beautifully summarized in what became the Jesuit motto, "For the greater glory of God." This wasn't about grandiose projects or impressive achievements that would bring human recognition. It was about learning to choose whatever option in any situation would most fully honor divine love and serve human flourishing. Sometimes that meant dramatic missionary journeys to foreign countries. Sometimes it meant quiet conversations with individuals struggling in their faith. Sometimes it meant starting schools or hospitals. Sometimes it meant simply being fully present to whoever God placed in their path. The beauty of this approach is that it makes every moment of life potentially sacred, every relationship potentially apostolic, every decision potentially significant for the kingdom of God. You don't have to be a priest or religious professional to live out the divine message that Ignatius received. You just have to learn to ask, in whatever situation you find yourself, how can I respond here in a way that honors divine love and serves the good of others? This question, applied consistently over time, can transform your entire existence into a living prayer, a continuous conversation with God about how to participate most fully in the divine mission of love. But let's acknowledge something that Ignatius discovered and that you might be experiencing. Living this way isn't always easy or comfortable. God's message to Ignatius included clear warnings about the resistance that comes from what he called disordered attachments, the ways we become enslaved to particular outcomes, possessions, relationships, or even spiritual experiences that prevent us from responding freely to divine movement. Ignatius learned through painful experience that spiritual freedom requires ongoing detachment from anything that makes us less available to God's call. This doesn't mean becoming cold or indifferent to people and circumstances. Rather, it means developing what Ignatius called indifference, the spiritual freedom to embrace whatever God allows or asks, whether it brings pleasure or pain, success or failure, consolation or desolation. This kind of spiritual maturity comes only through practice, through repeatedly choosing to trust divine wisdom even when it conflicts with our immediate preferences or desires. God's message to Ignatius about spiritual freedom was both liberating and demanding. Liberating because it promised that we can find peace and purpose regardless of external circumstances. Demanding because it required constant vigilance against the subtle ways our egos try to control divine grace and manipulate spiritual experience for our own satisfaction. Ignatius learned that true union with God means allowing divine love to transform our desires, rather than trying to use prayer and spiritual practices to fulfill desires that haven't been purified by grace. This is where the divine message becomes intensely practical for your daily life. Every time you face a decision, every time you experience an emotional reaction to circumstances, every time you notice yourself wanting something or avoiding something, you have an opportunity to practice the same discernment that God taught to Ignatius. You can ask, is this desire drawing me closer to divine love and service, or is it pulling me towards self-centered satisfaction? Am I choosing this option because it genuinely serves God's purposes, or because it protects my ego and comfort? These questions, asked honestly and regularly, gradually develop the spiritual sensitivity that allows you to recognize and respond to divine communication in your own life. The message God gave to Ignatius about spiritual discernment wasn't intended to make life more complicated or anxious. It was meant to simplify everything by providing a clear criterion for evaluating thoughts, desires, and choices. The fundamental question becomes, does this draw me closer to God and make me more available to serve others? Or does it increase my attachment to things that ultimately cannot satisfy the deepest longings of my heart? This kind of clarity, developed through practice, can cut through the confusion and indecision that often paralyze us when we're trying to figure out God's will for our lives. As Ignatius matured in his understanding of divine communication, he began to see that God's message wasn't only about individual spiritual development. The same divine love that transforms personal lives is also at work in human communities, institutions, and social structures. God was calling Ignatius and his companions not only to personal holiness, but to apostolic engagement with the world's greatest needs. This led to the establishment of schools, hospitals, missions, and various forms of social service that addressed both spiritual hunger and material poverty. The divine message included a vision of faith that engages actively with culture, science, politics, and social justice, not as separate secular concerns, but as integral dimensions of God's kingdom. Ignatius learned that you cannot truly love God without loving what God loves, and God loves the entire world with all its beauty and brokenness. This means that authentic spirituality will always lead to some form of service to human flourishing, whether in your immediate family and community or in broader social engagement. This aspect of God's message challenges any understanding of faith that treats religious practice as a private hobby separate from concerns about justice, mercy, and care for creation. The God who spoke to Ignatius is the same God who calls you to recognize divine presence, not only in your personal prayer, but in your responsibility to care for neighbors, especially those who are most vulnerable and marginalized. The message wasn't about escaping the world, but about discovering how divine love is already at work in the world, and joining that work with whatever gifts and opportunities you've been given. Here's what might surprise you about the ultimate message God communicated to Ignatius. It wasn't complicated theological doctrine or elaborate spiritual techniques. The core message was actually beautifully simple. You are unconditionally loved by God, and that love is calling you into freedom and service. Everything else, the methods of prayer, the principles of discernment, the approaches to apostolic work, all of these were simply practical ways to help people recognize and respond to this fundamental truth about divine love. God's message to Ignatius was that most people go through life not realizing how deeply they are loved by their Creator, how constantly they are surrounded by divine grace, how specifically they are called to participate in the ongoing creation of a more loving world. The tragedy isn't that God is absent or silent, but that we've learned to live with such noise and distraction that we can't hear the divine voice that's speaking to us continuously through our deepest desires, our circumstances, our relationships, and our opportunities to serve. If these reflections on the divine message God gave to Ignatius have resonated with something deep in your spiritual journey, I want to invite you to join our community of seekers who are committed to discovering God's presence in everyday life. By subscribing to this channel, you'll receive regular encouragement and practical wisdom drawn from the treasury of Christian spirituality, especially the insights of saints like Ignatius, who learned to recognize divine communication in the midst of ordinary human experience. You're not alone in your desire for a deeper relationship with God. Many of us are on this same journey of learning to listen more attentively to divine love and to respond more generously to God's call in our daily lives. Thank you for dedicating this time to spiritual reflection. Your openness to growth is already a sign that God's message is reaching your heart. The message God gave to Ignatius continues to unfold in your life right now, in this very moment, as you consider how these insights might apply to your current circumstances and relationships. You don't have to wait for some future spiritual breakthrough or dramatic mystical experience. The divine communication that transformed a wounded soldier into one of history's great spiritual guides is available to you today, speaking through the movements of your own heart, inviting you into the same freedom and purpose that Ignatius discovered over 500 years ago. What God told Ignatius, God is telling you. You are loved beyond your ability to comprehend. You are called to a life of meaning and service that will satisfy your deepest longings, and you have everything you need to begin responding to that call right where you are. The voice that spoke to Ignatius in that hospital room is speaking to your heart right now, offering the same message of hope, the same invitation to transformation, the same promise that your life can become a living prayer, a continuous conversation with divine love that transforms not only your own existence, but touches every person and situation that crosses your path. This is God's message to you through Ignatius. Wake up to the love that surrounds you. Learn to recognize divine communication in your daily experience, and allow that recognition to shape you into an instrument of the same love you've received. Your spiritual journey isn't about becoming someone different than who you are. It's about discovering who you've always been in God's eyes and living from that identity with increasing freedom and joy. The message that changed Ignatius's life is meant to change yours too, because the God who spoke to him is the same God who has been speaking to your heart all along, waiting for you to recognize the divine voice that calls you by name and invites you into the adventure of participating in divine love that is transforming the world.